Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 3rd of May, 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish. We're also joined by Mark Anderson, Truth Hound, and David Scott with Northern Exposure. David, of course, reporting from north of the border. More good news, Mike.
Oh, it's fantastic. That's 2 days in a row. We've started with good news. So good news. Today is World Press Freedom Day. We're delighted to report that. So World Press Freedom Day 2018, Antonio Guterres said he calls on governments to strengthen press freedom and to protect journalists. Promoting a free press is standing up for our right to truth. And of course, what he means by that is that promoting a controlled press is standing up for their right to control the narrative. So let's go on. Apparently, it was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in December 1993. It's been an annual event ever since. And this is following recommendations, or was following recommendations from UNESCO's General Conference. It's the opportunity, they say, to celebrate the fundamental principles of press freedom, assess the state of press freedom throughout the world, defend the media from attacks on their independence, and pay tribute to journalists who have lost their lives in the line of duty. But the theme for 2018 is keeping power in check, media, justice, and the rule of law. So they say that this highlights the importance of an enabling legal environment for press freedom, and special attention is given to the role of an independent judiciary in ensuring legal guarantees for press freedom and the prosecution of crimes against journalists. At the same time, the theme addresses the role of the media in sustainable development, especially during elections, as a watchdog, fostering transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. So, well, that was what the United Nations has to say. The Foreign Office, they tweeted this out, that press freedom is under threat as never before. The UK is committed to media freedom and protection of journalists around the world. So they are pretending to be concerned about the lives of journalists, when in fact all they're really concerned about is whether they can control a narrative or not. So that's what's going on there. The BBC pushed out a nice article all about World Press Freedom Day, asking, are journalists increasingly under attack? And there was one graph in this which caught my attention, and that was this one, journalist and media worker deaths. And it shows a bar graph from 1990 to the more or less the present. And what we see in the last 3 years in particular, last 3 years in particular, is a huge decline in the number of journalists and media workers who have died in the course of doing their jobs. And Mark, if I start with you, then the first question in my mind is why is this? And I suspect that the reason is that there are not many journalists that are actually getting out in the field these days.
Oh, certainly. For one thing, the technology, the way the internet is, the way that we don't have to leave our cubicles, I say the word our in a loose general sense. I worked in mainstream press for a number of years, and even then it was getting increasingly easy to stay in your cubicle, use the telephone, and not have to get off your arse and go out and do anything. But when you're faced with a little bit of perceived danger, and you consider all the risks of the road and the fact that more news organizations are doing more with less, they're making one guy wear 10 hats and all that kind of thing, naturally the tendency is to stay home, stay dry, keep your latte warm, and just do it from remote. And you add a little danger to the mix, and they're not going to go out and do anything. And but of course, the big trade-off is you don't know what's going on, and you begin to rely on unsavory or unreliable characters for your information. And pretty soon the journalistic value goes way down.
David, this is all true, but of concern as a result, of course, is the reliance that mainstream media is making on what's described as open source sources, i.e. Twitter, and also the fact that this contagion is even spreading to government and intelligence services.
And international politics, and indeed peace in our time now seems to be arranged via Twitter. The Press Freedom Day, it's the UNESCO Press Freedom Day. It's a UNESCO resolution that set this up. You know, UNESCO have a lot to hide. UNESCO have a lot of scandals. I wonder if UNESCO are really serious about being a free press when it comes to examining their skeletons in their closets. And I also saw, Mike, that yesterday was World Tuna Day. So I wonder if there's a secret message there that somehow press freedom might be floundering.
Yes.
Is that tuna day or is it to do with fish?
Fish, I think it's fish as opposed to songs. Yeah.
Okay, I was just checking in case that was fake news you were trying to bring in there. But there is some good news because while we've been discussing this particular subject, in our chat box, somebody pointed out that the Hereford Times has just appointed a gentleman called Carmelo Garcia. He's joined the paper as the new local democracy reporter. And of course, this is the BBC's $8 million a year fund to put 150 BBC democracy journalists into local papers. So we shouldn't worry, really. You know, the BBC is in there looking after democracy, hopefully tuna as well.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to this. Interesting article here in Thrive Global. The headline is Business with Purpose, Why I Love My Job. And this is an article written by Siobhan Haviland, who's Deputy Director of Business Partnerships in the Cabinet Office. Now, the Cabinet Office is, I suppose we could say, Brian, the de facto government, because, of course, Theresa May and her cabinet are merely mouthpieces for what goes on in the Cabinet Office. Is that an unfair statement?
Not unfair at all. And, of course, the Cabinet Office was running the whole of the Common Purpose agenda, so...
Yep. So let's look at the subhead. It says how partnerships between business and government can drive innovation and tackle our nation's challenges. And she says fast-paced, varied, never a dull moment. Life in government is all of these things and more, working day to day at the heart of government between the Cabinet Office and Number 10, even more so. But it's the way that my job allows me to bring together big business and government to drive social change that makes it special. My team works on a number of projects that are doing just that, as well as bringing the voice of business into early policy development. Our partnership with, she gives examples now, our partnership with Apolitical showcases innovative UK policy globally and brings together best practice for government. This means civil servants can connect internationally, sharing innovative ideas and making our impact on projects, policy and campaigns greater. And she goes on to say one of our major projects at the moment, it has the sole aim of building a more inclusive economy and society. The Inclusive Economy Partnership is a campaign at the heart of government's agenda that is bringing together companies, charities and the public sector to tackle the major societal challenges of today. The project focuses on three main areas: mental health, transition into work and financial inclusion. And she says, bringing this project to life allows me to work in an area I'm passionate about, driving innovation and change in our society, combining businesses with purpose. No one type of organization can impact this change on its own, but together, business, civil society and government can change today's society for the better. Now, David, this is something that the UK column, this change in the nature of our governance and the relationship between us as individuals and how we're governed, this bringing in of external non-governmental organizations, whether those be private sector companies or charities or whatever it is, we are moving in the direction of a form of corporatism that I think we have never seen before. And most people don't really understand what's coming down the road.
No, and the answer is, of course, fascism. This mixture of business interests and government coercion is extremely threatening. I'm amazed at that little article there. Big business and government joining together to drive social change. Is that not meant to be a secret? Is she meant to be telling us that we're being engineered for big government and big business interests? I thought that was a conspiracy theory, but I'm delighted it's out in the open now. What keeps business straight, what keeps business honest, is the sovereignty vested in the consumer, who can say, no, I don't like the way you're treating me, I'm going to go to your competitor down the road. And of course, with government, you can't really do that, because they do tend to get a little bit stabby if you try. I'm just checking out the dear lady's background here. lots of directorships. I wonder how much actual real world, small business experience building things up from the ground she has. She has spent 4 years, 10 months as an investor director with Insane Logic Limited. So that's good to know.
Okay, well, let's just have a look at an example of how this sort of collaboration works. And well done to Macron, because he popped over to Australia a little while ago. And as a result of that, we've got this future submarine design work to move to Australia from 2022. Thales partners with Australian universities for future submarine research. And it goes on here to say that the Memorandum of Understanding provides a long-term framework for collaboration in naval robotics application to both submarine and surface ship sonars. Opportunities share testing facilities, operate exchange programs, facilitate joint research projects. So it's the good old defence industry burying itself into another country, and of course the universities for full collaboration. That's what the lady's talking about.
Right. Shall we move on?
Indeed.
Okay. Right, Mark, let's bring you in at this point. The new localism, this of course is part of the new form of governance that we're beginning to experience here. But this is the Council for Global Affairs, the Chicago Council for Global Affairs. So I'm not quite sure why a globalist think tank is talking about localism, unless localism is some aspect of globalization and globalism that they're not really talking about. It's part of the alleged conspiracy theory that David was talking about there. But this presentation here called "How Cities Can Thrive in the Age of Populism."
Yeah, this is very interesting. I'm following the council and the Brookings Institution, the latter being a big part of the Bilderberg Network. I'm following them very closely now. They're really turning up the heat, guys. They're really broadening and deepening the global cities and anti-populism narrative. They've turned it up from kind of a simmer on the back burner to a pretty steady boil on the front burner. And this program accentuates that, as does another thing you're showing on the screen there. And what you and David were talking about a minute ago about the bureaucracy interacting and all these entities in society like business and non-government organizations and civic institutions. They never talk about individuals. They never talk about families. Everything is wrapped in some sort of collective networking entity. And so you have to look at their language and look at their concepts. But when Bruce Katz, Bilderberg 2014 in Denmark, he attended that, got together with Jeremy Nowak, a former member of the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Board, on, I believe it was April 23rd, without looking, on that new localism. They're really talking about a term I've used before, glocalism, where local and global go together, and they even do it with their words, glocalism. And what they talked about, among many other things, is, quote, the new localism very much is in tune with our global cities agenda here at the Chicago Council. So the Chicago Council itself says it has no, don't confuse its opinions with those of its guests, but then out of the other side of its mouth, they admit right up front that the speakers, the new localism, what they're talking about is in perfect tune with the Chicago Council's views. So they contradict themselves right there. And they talk about the metropolitan revolution, as they call it. And I could go many ways with this, but now they're getting into more details. They're not just turning up the heat, and they're not just talking about the general framework, guys. They're talking about what goes into that framework, the actual mechanisms. And one of the things they're using, and you showed it on the screen, is Copenhagen's City and Port Development Authority. And they also talk about Hafen City in Germany, and they're saying that these are models. And with these models, they're taking, quote, all the assets that the government owns, whether it's the national government or the local or state governments, whether it's special authorities, and they're putting all those assets under the aegis of one corporation, publicly owned but privately driven. The mayor will sit on the board, but it's professionally managed, and the yield from building these portfolios with public assets is used to supposedly build up our cities. Now, reportedly, it works pretty well in Copenhagen. in some respects. But but this is what they're doing. They want to take public assets and house them in one corporation and put them into a portfolio and form these public-private boards with the mayor at the head, but they'll be privately run. So this is an example of the actual machinery they want to put in tune with the rhetoric and philosophical framework they've been talking about with global cities. And by definition, that means anti-populism. What does that mean? It means that they really don't want any grassroots rebellion against all this because they see populism as a grievance thing, largely, that people are just mad about globalization, they're mad about free trade, and they look for a strong man to lick their wounds. And they don't want that grassroots angst bubbling from the bottom up and bringing about any changes that mess up their neat little system here. So if I had to summarize it pretty succinctly, that's what was said by Bruce Katz and Jeremy Nowak to the Chicago Council.
What I'd say to that is that we've had a program here of so-called regeneration of the port cities in UK, and what that regeneration entailed was largely the filling in of the maritime facilities in the ports. Liverpool, classic example, massive house building programs with no accompanying jobs, and the result has been stagnated cities. We saw this massive regeneration here in Plymouth, so the jobs around the dockyard absolutely devastated, local communities devastated, but the objective was to regenerate with house building, much of it of course advertised as cheap accommodation, but when it's been built, local people simply can't afford it. So this is very devious so-called regeneration. I think it's to help construct the city-state.
David, briefly, have you any thoughts on that?
I'm amazed where the term actually goes back to. I'm just checking here. Glocalization, first mentioned in the Harvard Business Review in the 1980s. And it seems to be, yes, a coming term, characterized by both local and global considerations. Yeah, it means everything, it means nothing. It means there's no control on the individual. And of course, to have a dynamic economy, these large corporate government bodies are not the way forward. What you actually need to do is unleash the potential of the people. And I don't see that coming through this method.
No, indeed. Now, well, last night or yesterday afternoon, Cambridge Analytica published a nice press release on their website saying that Cambridge Analytica and SCI Elections commence insolvency proceedings and release results of independent investigation into recent allegations. Well, it seemed like they were on their way, but apparently not, because as the Register and others have pointed out today, that in fact it has not been dismantled for good. It has simply changed its name to Emerdata, and what they're pointing out is that if you look at the details on Companies House, you find that Emerdata Limited has the same directors and the same management as Cambridge Analytica had. So, David, it looks like what's happened here is that with the major concern of loss of the narrative and the major concern that so-called fake news spreads on Facebook in particular faster than what the government describes as the truth and the mainstream media describes as the truth, that they felt that they needed to try to discourage activists from using Facebook, and that's happening, it seems to me, in two ways. One is the direct censorship approach, where Theresa May has pulled the heads of the social media networks into Number 10 Downing Street and bullied them into, or encouraged them to set up their various anti-extremism initiatives, which we're seeing the results of with increasing censorship, direct censorship on those social media platforms. And in parallel, we have the Cambridge Analytica story, which, where notionally we have an establishment organization run by ex-intelligence people being thrown to the wall in order to drive don't really want to call it paranoia, but drive concerns about data collection and personal data collection amongst particularly activists, discourage them from using Facebook, and therefore hopefully pull back from spreading what the government and the mainstream media don't like, which of course is the truth. But it's a pretty cynical attempt at this, because all they've actually done is throw a brand away and replaced it with another one.
Yes, yeah, it's simply rebranding. It's changing the name, and there's now nothing to see here. And the tie-in with the political parties and the use of large data, of government data, is the concern here. And obviously the fact that Facebook are clearly working hand in hand with the government is a threat to everyone. I do have hope that the free market will actually deal with companies even the size of Facebook, because if people decide no, enough's enough, their number can be up very, very quickly.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's move on a little bit, because here we've got the Network for Police Monitoring, they have produced a report saying Home Office forced by Netpol to release counter-radicalization training materials. Now, basically, this follows 2 years of effort to try to get what they suspected confirmed, and what they suspected was that particularly anti-fracking campaigners were being targeted under the counter-terrorism program, which is called Prevent. Now, we've talked about Prevent on this program many times. So this is the network, as I say, Network for Police Monitoring, Netpol, and they're saying that they have managed to get the release of certain documents, training manuals on the Prevent strategy, and this in particular has highlighted the types of extremism, terrorism stroke extremism is what the slide says, and that describes international extremism, extreme right wing, extreme left wing, Irish related, and finally domestic extremism, and they include animal rights and anti-fracking. Does that make us domestic extremists, Brian, for helping Ian Crane produce his Fracking Nightmare program?
I'm sure the answer to that's got to be yes, Mike, and this is the state of the country at the moment.
Right, and so following this training material being released, Netpol is continuing a legal battle. They are looking for statistics from the Home Office on anti-fracking campaigners referred to in their channel program, which is a parallel program to Prevent. It's the early intervention program. So Prevent identifies the people that they need to intervene with, and then Channel is an early intervention program for that. And Netpol said, we believe it's vital to know what impact, if any, falsely labelling opposition to fracking during training sessions may have had on referrals to Channel. And I would also like to know what effect such training has had perhaps on the police response to the fracking protests in the north of England, for example, where Manchester Police and Yorkshire Police as well being pretty heavy-handed with people that are protesting fracking. And of course, if what they're being taught is that these people are potentially violent domestic extremists, perhaps that explains something of the behaviour.
Yeah, so the police themselves are being reframed, they're being mentally reframed with this false narrative by the government's Prevent teams.
Yes, David, did you have something briefly?
Briefly, the UK government defines extremism as vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect, and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. That's actually news to me. Well, there you go. So I think you're in the clear this week.
Yeah, this week perhaps.
Oh, okay, thank you for that.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, let's come back to you and the Chicago Council of Global Affairs again. And this time we're concerned about the retreat of Western liberalism.
Yeah, that's Edward Luce, your friend and mine from the Financial Times. They're always President Bilderberg through Martin Wolf. Edward Luce tends to be a moderator at most Chicago Council and Chatham House and Brookings programs, those kind of programs. Here, instead of being a moderator, he chose to be a speaker. And his presentation goes hand in hand with one by Madeleine Albright recently to the Chicago Council called Fascism, a Warning. And it also goes hand in hand, believe it or not, with the program we just talked about earlier today, The New Localism with Bruce Katz and Jeremy Nowak. It's part of this continuum, part of this really heightening of their narrative that all forms of populism, left, right, any species of populism is bad. any kind of grassroots revival is bad or undesirable, and that global cities and liberalism, as they call it, is what we want universally. And so the retreat of Western liberalism, excuse me, is what he's talking about is that populists are illiberal. This is one of their words out of their globalese dictionary. They love the word illiberal. Almost sounds like they're trying to say illiterate. Like they're saying that if you're not liberal, you're illiberal, therefore you're illiterate. There's sort of that connotation there. But the retreat is that they believe, at least they say they believe, that their neoliberal, monopoly capitalist, world government kind of system, block by block, is beginning to fray at the edges. They're very concerned about Viktor Orban in Hungary and his reelection, very concerned about the Italian elections and the lurch to the right, very concerned about Austria, Germany, and even, of course, Donald Trump, as Mr. Luce was very loose in saying, loose lips, they say. And they're concerned about all these things as not just a annoyance, not just a something that's disturbing their little worldview, but they are actually saying that it's starting to push back, and they're getting a little nervous and starting to do this to their collars and sweat on their brows a bit. So they see Western liberalism as being almost in retreat, or at least getting ready to be, because I guess they believe that even with Marie Le Pen almost gaining the presidency, the head, the leadership of France, and all these other countries are named. They see this as not just a pushback, but as a real potential threat to what they're doing. And I don't have as many notes on Edward Luce's comments as I did the other guys in the New Localism, but what I can say is that he, more than the others, he voiced this narrative that the populism thing is more than just a annoyance, that it's something that they're having a trouble containing. They do admit that, yes, globalization, I should say, has given some people a raw deal. And to an extent, they understand the angst, but that, they want to regain the narrative. They don't want to let go of it. And they talk about the media as being something that should preserve their world democracy narrative and not give populists a real voice. And so they're just seeing a vulnerability to the world system that you and I and David critique all the time.
Mark, they're liberals except when they're criticised, and all of a sudden we are over to the fascist side. Let's have a look at this lady, Melanie Shaw, still in prison. What's her crime? Trying to speak out about her own child abuse and that of other people. She is still in prison at the moment, style prison. She doesn't know when she's getting out, although every prisoner in UK should know their release date. This lady apparently doesn't. We had hoped that she would be released in June, but at the moment we've still got no indication that that's the case. And remember, it was British Prime Minister Theresa May, as the former Home Secretary, who was lead for putting this child abuse survivor in prison. Why? Because of her information on high-level abusers in the British establishment. We've now got Sabine McNeill still in prison. There was a hearing yesterday which a reapplication for bail was refused. They significantly put this case in number 15 court at Southwark Crown Court. This was the smallest courtroom. There wasn't really any room for the public at all. And Sabine was not permitted to appear in court herself, so the appeal was rejected. Now, at the moment, Sabine is suffering as a 74-year-old lady. She's got certain problems, gallstones, and a very painful misaligned or possibly arthritic hip. They won't give her crutches, so she's been unable to leave her cell, and she hasn't been able to sleep due to the pain. The judge says, well, maybe we can bring the case forward to July or August. It is scheduled at the moment for November. And this is a lady who is simply on remand. She hasn't been sentenced for anything. If you just have a look online, you'll see that in plenty of other cases, people who've actually abused children or looked at child pornography simply allowed to walk free, but not a woman who's actually been campaigning to protect children and expose those carrying out the abuse of children. So amazing dual standards. Here it is happening in England, but of course, David, north of the border, much the same.
But no crisis, David.
There's no crisis. There's nothing to see here. Everything's fine, apart from a few details. Now, and some of these details were, believe it or not, reported in on the BBC on Monday, and this was looking at the background of the only, as far as we're aware, candidate for the top job in Scotland, Ian Livingstone.
This is the top job for Scottish Police, we should say.
Yes, this is the head of Police Scotland. This is extremely well paid. I think it's 214,000, I think it is, per annum, post to run the integrated, there can be only one police force in Scotland. But of course, DCC Livingstone has a background which is less than completely without clouds and skeletons and such like. And this was raised. He was asked about the case where he was accused of serious sexual assault on a WPC in the police college in Tullyallen. There was an inquiry into this. It was one person's word against another. The inquiry made no finding on that, and he was acquitted of the serious sexual assault. He did fall asleep in the WPC's room and was briefly disciplined for that. He was busted down to the ranks. He appealed, and then that reduction in rank was reversed. But the allegations are still being made by the officer, as far as I understand. And there's a lot of concern in Scotland over someone with that background being the candidate, the chosen candidate for the very top job in Police Scotland.
Former top officer says Livingstone is not fit to lead force. That's some of the media coverage on this. We have the Scottish Mail saying police chief's humiliating TV confession that he had too much to drink. This doesn't get better for him.
It doesn't. The response to this being raised was concerning. It was very dismissive. He said that there was really nothing to see here. The article, the former senior police officer Angela Wilson, now chairman of Women's Rape and Sexual Abuse Centre in Dundee after retiring from the force, said that the police should be above this kind of thing revealed by the BBC programme. We should be the most honest people in society. As far as I understand the case, it was one person's word against another. The police must have taken it very seriously to initially reduce him to the ranks. And his explanation, she said, was one I did not feel comfortable with. And on that sort of theme, he was asked about this, and he said, "Well, I wasn't suspended and busted down to the ranks." And then as he was questioned more, it was clear that he was busted down to the ranks, then suspended, and then he appealed and had the thing reversed. It wasn't a very convincing response to Sam Polling of the BBC asking him about this, and I think it's left a lot of people with greater doubts over him.
But as the Daily Record is reporting here, Police Scotland, what are they doing? Trying to hide corruption by removing allegations from an internal report?
Yes, this is an earlier report. This is under the previous, the before previous, under Stephen House. So Stephen House, the first head of Police Scotland, and he wanted negative comments deleted from the report. He marked up the report. We have a photograph of his revisions, scoring through negative comments and changing words, changing the tense, so that problems which are present became problems which were present, and the report was made to sound as though everything's really been fixed. Well, the report was fixed, and after it was adjusted in this way, it was then not shared with the Scottish Police Authority, who are the regulating body who are meant to oversee Police Scotland. It was not shared with the political representatives either. It was kind of put on a shelf somewhere, so it wasn't suppressed, but it certainly wasn't circulated widely. And that was even after all of the spikes had been pulled from it. In particular, the initial draft of the report talked about the police conducting unauthorised surveillance, threatening and intimidating witnesses, unlawfully detaining subjects, colluding over statements, and failing to reveal evidence. All of that was removed from the final report.
Okay, well, look, let's talk about the Sheikh Obeyo case. Now, it'll be a long time since we've talked about this, so maybe the first thing we should do is remind everybody what happened here.
Yeah, Sheikh Obeyo, this happened in 2015, in May 2015. Sheikh Obeyo was behaving strangely on the street. He may have taken some substance, we're not absolutely sure. Police were called, 9 officers restrained him. One of them was something like 25 stone. He was pinned to the ground for some time, and subsequent to this, he was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital a short time thereafter. So there's obviously enormous concern in the community about this. Sheikh Obeyo's relatives, friends, and partner were clearly devastated. They've been campaigning now for 3 years looking for the truth. Now, what happened was, well, it went to PERC. There's many troubling things about this case. For example, all the officers involved first spoke to the rep together in a way where they could collude and get stories straight before the investigating Police Scotland officer was even allowed to talk to them. And it went on like that. The Police Review Commission, PERC, they looked at this case. They made a report in August 2015. They made another report in August 2016. But we're now in 2018, and there's been no further progress as far as we can see. It's with the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service in Scotland, the state prosecutor, and their inquiries are ongoing. They said that in the last few months they've made some progress, but they still don't know when they're likely to come to an end of their investigation. So we're 3 years in, we don't know where it is. The family are confused, and the family have decided to take it to the civil courts, and they're suing Police Scotland for £1.85 million over the death of Sheikh Obeyo.
I think the other little bit to add, David, and correct me if I've got this wrong, but I believe that Peter Watson was acting for the police on the Sheikh Obeyo case. Peter Watson himself having been suspended as a judge over the Heather Capital fraud case, which later collapsed.
That's correct. Yes, he's the lawyer for the Scottish Police Federation, so he was acting personally for the officers involved. And it's just worth just hearing what the Crown Office says, because that's where the case is currently residing. The Crown Office said it's complex and challenging investigation, and no timescale can be put on the ruling on potential charges. Spokesman said this has been complex and challenging investigation. There's still some further considerable progress has been made in the last few months. This is after 3 years. It is not appropriate at this stage to commit to any timescale given the nature of the investigation. However, it's anticipated that a full report will be submitted for consideration to Crown Counsel. Anyone who knows the Robert Green, Holly Gregg case are familiar with this process. The most senior lawyers in the Crown Office in due course. So there we go. That's the timescale is
in due course.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you wanted to mention this, David, and that is about homeschooling and education. Now, the headline on this from the Children and Young People Now website is Department for Education announces review of homeschooling regulations. Give us a bit of the background to this before we talk about the campaign.
Well, the legal situation in Britain is that the responsibility for educating children lies with the parents, and the parents can discharge that responsibility in any way that they deem fit, appropriate for their family, and as long as the children receive an appropriate and reasonable education, that's fine. The parents have discharged that duty. And there is no need for government oversight and no requirement for government oversight. And more people, as our education system becomes ever more into crisis, as the standard of education delivered by the state manifestly drops, and as more and more people are finding problems relating to the state schooling system, more and more choosing home education as a way of overcoming the problems and providing the best start in life for their children. And this has now been viewed with suspicion by the government, who want to regulate this. They want to have a register. They want to start to check up. and there's a very vague document saying we must register, we must have some sort of supervisory role, but it's not going to be exactly supervisory. And when you're talking about a role, bringing people, you're talking about a role going into family life where education is fully integrated with the normal family life, the life and the education become seamless. To have the government having some sort of overseeing role in there is obviously quite Orwellian. So there's a lot of concern in the growing homeschool movement, home education movement, beg your pardon, over these moves. This next slide here is from the Isle of Man. This is a GoFundMe. They're looking for £3,000 here on this GoFundMe site to get a legal opinion so that they get a full legal definition of the rights for home education, so that they can take that to their and other governments within the UK and say that this is the legal situation, this is why you have to leave us alone, we're operating correctly, we're operating within the rights, and we do not require your services unless we come and ask for them. So I hope they will get some support for their GoFundMe fight there.
So for anybody that wants to find that, it's called Protect All Home Education Rights on GoFundMe.com. Right, David, let's move on to this. Now, I sent you this earlier in the week because what interested me about this building collapse in Brazil was that it was notionally a high-rise building which had collapsed following a fire, and the implication that was being presented between the lines, shall we say, in the mainstream media was that this was similar to 9/11, and that perhaps this gives some support to the official narrative of how the buildings collapsed in those days. Now, you're a structural engineer by trade, so I thought no better person to get some thoughts on what happened here.
Well, a situation less like 9/11, it would be hard to imagine. The information on this building is a bit thin in the ground. I was trying to get some technical information and really could find none. It's variously stated as being 24 and 26 stories, so much smaller than the buildings in New York. Based only on the photographic evidence in the mainstream press, no one was actually discussing the construction. It would appear to be an in situ reinforced concrete frame, so an entirely different form of construction from the towers in America. It was a former police headquarters that had been abandoned, and squatters had moved in and created their own dwellings within it. Now, there was various fire hazards that resulted. One was the lifts had been removed, so that the lift shafts were chimneys, and debris, rubbish, refuse, etc., was being dumped by the residents down these lift shafts. So there was a huge fire hazard there, and also the buildings and dwellings had created within the structure were often of timber or combustible material. So there was a lot of combustible material and routes for the fire to spread. So what appears to have happened is the fire spread more or less top to bottom. The bottom 8-9 stories were very strongly alight. Now, the next thing you see here is the color of the flame. The color that's generated when things burn is related to the temperature very strongly and accurately. So if you look at the 9/11 fires, you see dull red flames and a lot of black smoke. So it's an oxygen star fire, very low temperature fire. This is much, much hotter. And over many stories, it's fully engulfed, at least 9 stories there, but also the fire extended all the way to the very top of the building. The next thing is that it was the lift shaft that seemed to go first. That was quite significant. Again, that would suggest refuse within the lift shaft would be the main source of the fire, or the seat of the fire. And then as the building came down, what you had was an enormous shower or cloud of burning embers, sparks and things. It's clearly more or less the entire contents of this building were on fire, which is quite different from the 9/11 case, where you had a lot of dust, but really the fire was incidental to the collapse. So the core here is reinforced concrete buildings are less reliable in fire than protected steel ones. The building itself is much less robust than particularly the Twin Towers. and the fire itself has no similarity with what happened in New York. So I would think anyone pointing to this as an explanation of 9/11 is not going to get much traction at all.
Good stuff, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, at this point, we'll put in an ad for our Dying for Good Health conference in the Albert Hall, Nottingham, 12th of May. As I said yesterday, tickets are going, so if you haven't got your tickets yet, get onto the UK Column website and you can buy your tickets through the website. This will be an absolutely unique event, and the timing is just perfect because of the immense amount of things happening around the NHS and privatisation. This brings us on nicely to Alder Hey Hospital, Mike.
Yeah, Alfie, the Alfie story. And well, somebody reminded us, and thank you very much to the person who did, that of course one of our other websites is Common Purpose Exposed. We have been talking about the common purpose effect in public bodies quite a lot over the last few years. And of course, if anybody wants to understand more about that, particularly with relating to the National Health Service, have a look on the UK Column website for an article entitled Towards a Million Change Agents. But what our correspondent had pointed out to us, of course, is on the Common Purpose Exposed website. We have a list of Common Purpose graduates. And if we look there, we find that the former chief executive of Alder Hey Hospital is a Common Purpose graduate. And indeed, the current chief executive, who was not part of Alder Hey Hospital at the time, but is now, is also a Common Purpose graduate. So this hospital has had quite a number of years of this type of leadership, in inverted commas, influence, and perhaps Alfie's story reflects that.
Indeed, and we'll just follow that along. This is back to 2012, and one of our viewers said, you really need to push this one out again because it was never answered in a satisfactory way, which indeed it wasn't. Top doctor's chilling claim the NHS kills off 130,000 elderly patients every year. And what are they talking about? They're talking about the so-called care pathways. This was some of the statistics the article mentioned. There are around 450,000 deaths in Britain each year of people who are in hospital or under NHS care, and around 29%, that's the 130,000, are patients who were on the Liverpool care pathway. So this particular professor said that, he claimed that far too often elderly patients who could live longer are placed on the LCP and had now become an assisted death pathway rather than a care pathway. Now, we know that there's some very damning statistics out around the Staffordshire hospital deaths, and approximately 10, maybe 11 other hospitals. These were suppressed by the UK government at the time, and what we're still seeing is a reluctance of central UK government to talk about how these deaths are occurring. Do we believe that the figures are extremely high, in the multiple thousands? Yes, we do, but information suppressed. Meanwhile, of course, everybody is terribly excited as laboratories work towards growing people. And this one I find particularly disturbing, Mike. Scientists create an embryo from stem cells without egg or sperm in what they say is provocative research, but the article then pacifies it all down. We need this for infertility, but actually the main line was that we need this for drug testing because there's a bit of a shortage of embryos. So, yeah, nasty stuff.
Okay, brief reminder of AV9, which begins tomorrow. Now, of course, this has an impact on the UK Column News because both Brian and I will be on our way to the venue tomorrow. So there'll be no UK Column News tomorrow and no UK Column News on Monday while that conference takes place. We look forward to meeting everybody that is at that. But we have to say that yesterday we said there were 2 rooms available, had come available. Well, those were snapped up extremely quickly. So we're back to saying that there are still some day tickets available. If you would like to get them, you can do so at alternativeview.co.uk.
Yeah, excellent. So we say thank you very much to our guests, gentlemen, for joining us today. And also, if our listeners are not already a subscriber of UK Column, then please do subscribe. We can only do what we do with your financial support. And if you'd like to give us some help over the coming days and weeks, then perhaps you'd help to locate some of these BBC democratic journalists, because this sounds just a fantastic thing that the BBC is looking after democracy in local papers amongst local communities. Great stuff.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.